is that oxalate is a poison. It's a known poison. It's a toxin. It can cause mechanical or structural irritation to any tissue that it comes into contact with. And so it might present as something like idiopathic arthritis or idiopathic fibromyalgia, idiopathic neuropathy, hashimotos, thyroiditis. You can also see problems with gut motility, problems with intestinal permeability. Kidney function becomes impaired. It's so damn insidious, and that oftentimes someone can be accumulating this stuff, not getting rid of it for years, for years, in fact, for decades. It has been known to kill people, okay? It can kill people. Most of the time, you can get the nutrients everywhere else in other foods which are not high oxalate. So really, there's no reason other than addiction and taste for people eating massive amounts of these foods. It's causing damage, it's causing oxidative stress, and they need to find a way to safely get rid of that.
For those who haven't heard about oxalates, could you just give a brief overview of what are oxalates, and then maybe what are some of the higher oxalate containing foods?
Okay, great. So a really simple way to conceptualize what oxalate is, your listeners are probably familiar with the concept that plant foods can contain some chemicals within them which can cause problems for human beings, right? So if you look at kind of proteins and things found in grains or legumes, they can trigger autoimmune reactions. We have kind of phytochemicals, which can cause oxidative stress. We have kind of lots of these different chemicals in plants, which can generally cause problems for human beings under certain circumstances. Well, oxalate is kind of falling under that category. It's a type of molecule that is found in certain plant foods. And when human beings consume too much of this, then it can cause problems. That's a really simple way of looking at it. A simple way to kind of conceptualize what an oxalate actually is. Well, the way that it's found in nature is it's bound with minerals. And when it's bound with minerals, it turns into like a shard of glass or a crystal. And this can be classified as kind of soluble in water or non-soluble or insoluble in water, meaning that it's less able to be absorbed into the body, but it can still potentially cause issues when it's in the diet. I probably focus so much on oxalate, and why it interests me so much is primarily because you've got the other plant toxins, you've got the lectins, you've got salicylates, phenols, which can cause temporary reactions. We know that things like lectins found in grains or legumes or certain vegetables, we know that they can trigger autoimmunity via mechanisms in the gut and also systemically. But the good thing is with those is that when you take those out of the diet, what you end up seeing is ultimately the problem gets better pretty quickly. Okay. There's no like real accumulation. Now, there have been some studies showing like lectins getting stuck in different organs and things, but as a general rule, there's no long-term accumulation of this stuff in the body. Now, that does not apply to oxalate. In fact, with oxalate, that is exactly the opposite to what happens. And this is why I think it's so interesting and why it's so damn insidious. And that oftentimes someone can be accumulating this stuff, not getting rid of it for years, for years, in fact, for decades, right? For decades. And the problem becomes progressively worse. And oftentimes they only display symptoms when it's too late. What I mean is when it's too late, what I mean is when they've got a significant body burden that is going to take them a long time to get rid of. And this is the thing with oxalate, is that when you stop eating oxalate, it's not just as simple as, okay, now everything's fixed. Right? In fact, no, stopping eating oxalate is the first step, and often it's the easiest step, because, really for people who have oxalate problems, it's going to take potentially years to get rid of this stuff from the body. And really, it's just the start of their journey. So different types of foods which contain oxalate, oftentimes, ironically, these are foods which are kind of promoted as health providing foods. So this can be cacao, many of the green vegetables, including spinach, collard greens, Swiss chard, certain berries, raspberries, blackberries, certain varieties of blueberries, the grains. In fact, most of the grains are very high in oxalate, particularly the gluten-free grains of starches, including sweet potato. Sweet potato is particularly high, but also white potato. Nuts. Nuts are extraordinarily high in oxalate, particularly almonds. In fact, almonds are some of the worst offenders because almond flour is really popular and it tastes really good, in my opinion, right? Especially like almond flour brownies. damn, they are absolutely gorgeous, but they're highly addictive. And those things are like oxalate nightmares, believe me. And I used to live on those things, right? A lot of other people do it because they're healthy, because they're gluten-free and it's low sugar and it's natural, raw cacao. We do also have foods which are plant foods, which are not actually that high. I mean, you have lettuce, for example, which basically has almost no oxalate. Cucumber, butternut squash, some of the grains. I mean, rice, if it's white rice, then it's going to be low because the oxalate content is contained within the husk of the rice or the bran. So it's going to be high in brown rice or higher, and then kind of lower in white rice. So that's kind of, I'd say, a rough overview of where you're going to be getting these. Oftentimes, if vegans or vegetarians or even people in the paleo community, ketogenic community, consume foods which are higher kind of in the phytonutrient chemicals or whatever, or they're trying to be healthy. So for instance, one of the kind of fads is to make smoothies that someone puts in raw cacao powder, spinach, some other greens into the smoothie, and then they might also add some spices. And spices are generally pretty high as well. So specific spices, if we look at like turmeric, it's extremely high. Cinnamon, black pepper is very high. There's certain things which are very high, and when eaten in low amounts, it's not necessarily going to cause people a problem. But when eaten in high amounts over prolonged periods of time or under certain circumstances, these can cause real kind of long-term health issues for a variety of people.
Sounds like it's almost every single fruit and vegetable. Now, what are these long-term health problems that people will have then? Because initially, like if I were to eat some cinnamon and some spinach, I don't think I'm going to notice anything immediately. But I was somebody who used to make a spinach smoothie every single day, and so what could happen from having too much high oxalate foods?
Yeah, okay. So coming back to the structure of oxalate, like if we think of, again, shards of glass traveling through your bloodstream, precipitating into tissue, it can actually crystallize. And shards of glass, if you were to rub your finger or rub your skin against broken glass, you would get irritation. Like that is one of the first things that oxalate can cause. So it can cause mechanical or structural irritation to any tissue that it comes into contact with. It can cause damage, like structural damage to the blood vessels, for instance. It can cause structural damage to the organs. So we just think from a very basic level, it's causing some structural damage as it's traveling through the bloodstream, as it's making its way to the kidneys. What I haven't said is, as oxalate is getting into the bloodstream, it has a very, very, very high affinity for different minerals. Primarily, it's going to be calcium, but it can also be potassium, it can also be sodium, it can also be magnesium. Now, as it has a high affinity, what that means is it really likes to bind with things. So if we consume a lot of oxalate, first thing it's going to do is it's actually going to bind to our own minerals. Okay, so we've got minerals floating around in the blood, and that's really important. What it actually has, what it has an effect to do, essentially, is deplete us of minerals first things first. We said that it's causing damage as it's going around the body, but as it's getting to the kidney, you can end up with what's called like kind of precipitation or crystallization when it comes into contact with calcium, because it has a very high or tight binding capacity with calcium. It can actually form like into crystals. Okay. And as you have these deposits of crystals within the kidney, this is like triggering all kinds of potential issues. So kidney function becomes impaired. Actually, the majority, so around 80% of people with kidney stones, if you measure the stone composition, it's actually calcium oxalate. And that's pretty significant, meaning that, the majority of people who get kidney stones have a problem with oxalate. However, conventional medical thinking does not acknowledge that oxalate can cause a problem anywhere else in the body. And really, it could not be further from the truth. As it turns out, is that aside from like this kind of structural irritation as it's traveling through the bloodstream, it turns out that these stones or these crystals can very much deposit anywhere else in the body. And so if you look at the medical literature, it's been documented on numerous cases that oxalate can form these crystals throughout practically every known organ. That means that's the liver, that's the spleen, that's the lymph nodes, that's the connective tissue. In fact, it seems to kind of have a very high affinity for the connective tissue. And in that kind of situation, what it might produce is a condition which affects that area of the body. So I'll give you a couple of examples, right? If we've got someone who has consumed a very high oxalate diet, one thing I want to preface this with is that oxalate is a poison. It's a known poison. It's a toxin. Now, ordinarily in small amounts, it's not going to cause that much of a problem. But when it's in high amounts, it has been known to kill people. Okay, it can kill people. But so I was going to go through some examples of what it might look like if you have oxalate deposition in your tissue, how that might present. So if you've got someone who's consumed a high amount of oxalate for a long period of time, and they've not had any kind of protection against that, and they've accumulated that, how that's going to look in someone who has a lot of that deposited, let's say in the joints of the knees, in the connective tissue of the hands, of the knuckles, that might present as arthritis. Okay. So someone might go to their conventional doctor and get the diagnosis of idiopathic arthritis. They might go for an autoimmune panel. They might show elevated rheumatoid factor, indicating that they've got rheumatoid arthritis, but in many cases they won't. Now, so what that literally is these crystals or these deposits, every time that you imagine, again, shards of glass, stuck into the joint of the knuckle. Every time you move that knuckle, that's going to cause physical pain. And that's just the physical irritation of something solid, like a solid, physical structure stuck in your joint. And that's literally what happens with people with oxalate problems. And so it might present as something like arthritis. On the other hand, we might have someone who has systemic oxalate deposits within the muscle tissue or the connective tissue, which is surrounding the muscles. So it might not be in the joints. And it might be the case that every time that they push or touch their muscles, they end up with fibromyalgia type pain. And so what they might go to a rheumatologist and they might receive a diagnosis of fibromyalgia. Does that mean they have fibromyalgia? Well, it depends how you kind of classify fibromyalgia. Actually, the problem that's causing their issue, or the root cause of their problem, is oxalate within the muscles. And so again, this is not something that's easily identified. Not many people are going to be having muscle biopsies to be able to identify if they've got calcium oxalate within their muscles, but it can happen. And this can happen everywhere else in the body as well, particularly the thyroid gland. In fact, there was a very good, interesting research paper that came out a while ago looking at, I think it was females over 60, and they identified, I think it was like in at least 50%, but I'm pretty sure the percentage was much higher. At least 50% of them had a significant number of oxalate crystals within their thyroid gland. And what you have to understand is that wherever there is oxalate deposited throughout the body, the immune system is detecting this as a foreign invader, right? This is a stressor because it's a toxin. And so what's going to happen is that as you start to accumulate this in an organ, your immune system can then start to attack it. So what can often be seen as an autoimmune condition is sometimes spurred on by oxalate deposition in that area. I'll give you an example. Another one is hashimotos thyroiditis. In fact, I've had numerous people who, after going on a low oxalate diet, not only did their thyroid numbers improve, but their thyroid antibodies also came down back into normal range. And I think the explanation for something like this is these are the kinds of people who have oxalate deposited in the gland. The immune system picks this up, and over a long period of time, you end up with immune dysfunction. So you have oxidative stress in the gland, you have tissue damage, and you have the production of antibodies against that tissue. But again, it's not being caused by anything else. Sometimes it's being caused by this physical problem of too much oxalate in that organ. A couple more examples might be idiopathic neuropathy. So it can deposit, it can stick within the nerve and actually prevent the nerve from being able to send the message to the next neuron. Now, something which surprises many people is that ultimately this can also affect the gut. And in fact, this is probably one of the first signs of oxalate problems that I see is people with chronic gut issues that particularly get worse when they eat high oxalate foods. But this could range from, it's not just like, constipation or diarrhea. I mean, diarrhea is very common in people who have oxalate, but really it's anything which is affecting the enteric nervous system. We can also see problems with gut motility, problems with intestinal permeability. Again, not only is oxalate kind of triggering oxidative stress wherever it goes, but it can also trigger inflammation. And that is one of the things that can drive many of the gut issues that people, so commonly have and are taking all these supplements and things to fix, when ultimately it can be because the food that they've been told is healthy and the food that they've been over consuming is causing a long-term problem. And so, some of the key signs and symptoms of people who have oxalate problems Again, I said about some of the conditions, it can be like idiopathic arthritis or idiopathic fibromyalgia, but really the key signs and symptoms, people who I see, it's going to be a mixture of kind of body pains or joint pains, and they can come and go. They can go in different places. It's going to be, can be kind of gut pain after eating, diarrhea, which feels as though it burns. There can be like blood from lower in the urinary tract because there's irritation. It can be like burning urine, bladder issues, pain when urinating. And one of the main reasons for that is because you're literally pissing out glass. That's basically what it is. You can have neurological signs and symptoms, neuropathy, nerve pain, burning, tingling. There can be really any number of symptoms that people can have. And this is why it's kind of so difficult to diagnose. And it's also why a lot of people kind of assume everything is oxalate. And I want to make it clear that not everyone has an issue with oxalate. In fact, many people don't, probably most people. Some people do, however, and if they do have a problem, it can present in any number of ways. And they don't really know that they've got an oxalate problem unless they try a low oxalate diet. So I hope that kind of gives a rough overview of what we're talking about here.
Absolutely. So I have a video on my channel actually from over a year ago where I say I'm going to reintroduce sweet potatoes, but I can't have them every single day because I had done that before where I had them every day of the week and my joints and my knees were in pain. And so I just started having them one time a week. And granted, I haven't noticed any severe joint pain, but maybe it's just because it's not as, obviously it's not as frequent as that I'm eating it, but what would be a tolerable amount of oxalates? And even, I would even think something like a sweet potato. Is there any way to mitigate the amount of oxalates in the foods, whether that's like fermenting or boiling or sprouting or soaking, or no, it's like the oxalates in there, there's no way to avoid them and to minimize the amount of oxalates in these plants.
Yeah. Okay. So, kind of healthy amount. That's again very much up to discussion. There's a lot of thoughts on that. I have my own thoughts on that. Probably a lot of people disagree. I think that an average rule, so for the general population, probably 100 to 150 milligrams is likely okay if they don't have any underlying health issues. Yeah. If they don't have any underlying health issues and they don't have any significant gut issues, they don't have a history of having high amounts of oxalate or any kind of genetic issue, then I'm going to say that probably, 100 to 150 milligram is likely not going to cause a problem for a lot of people. That being said, a low oxalate diet, medically speaking, they have come up with the number of 50 milligrams per day is basically a low oxalate diet. Now, if you've got something like spinach, for example, if you're having a spinach smoothie with, dark chocolate, with turmeric, with cinnamon, with that kind of stuff, you can easily top 1,000 milligrams just in that one smoothie. There are cases of people, having up to 2 grams per day. I just want to tell you that the established toxic dose of oxalate, so enough to kill someone in one go, I think I remember it being 4 grams. So if you have 4 grams, then that is enough to put you into acute kidney failure and actually kill you there and then. Now, if you consider that it's 4 grams, people are potentially getting a quarter, even if more than that, in one smoothie, if they go, all out. Particularly the people who use dried types of these vegetables and things as well in these powders, because you can consume a lot more if something's dehydrated. A lot of it is the water content you're eating and kind of fills you up. So when you dehydrate this stuff, and this is one of the reasons why turmeric powder is way higher than raw turmeric, because raw turmeric actually contains the water and the fiber and things. So just to give you an example, how much you might find in spinach, half a cup of raw green baby spinach, when it was tested, works out to 768 milligrams of oxalate. Okay, half a cup. That's raw. So you think the amount of people who, I don't know about yourself, but if someone is a vegan, I know that when I was doing paleo, I would be having like a whole bag of spinach every single day. Now, half a cup of raw spinach is not a lot. Like it's not a lot at
Yeah.
all. And if you notice, when you cook it, it goes right down. So it's really easy to use a whole bag of spinach in a meal if you actually want to taste the spinach. You know, that's a shocking amount. Really, when we talk about high oxalate diet, again, this is up for discussion. I would say anything, probably above 300 to 400 milligrams is going to be pretty high. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone eating that diet is going to have a problem. They might be able to get rid of it quite well, but a lot of people who consume that amount, they're potentially going to have problems. On the concept of like sweet potato, you want to know how much is in sweet potato? We can get
I don't even know if I want to know, but you can tell me.
So sweet potato, if it's boiled and it's mashed, half a cup provides about 95 milligrams of soluble oxalate. Okay. So compare that to half a cup of baby spinach, which provides like 700. It's significantly lower. Potato, again, if you have, so one medium potato, which is red, brand Desiree, I think it is, and that's baked, you get like 64 milligrams oxalate per potato. So again, like these are considered high compared against something like butternut squash, because that might contain like 5 to 10 milligrams or something like that. Or avocado provides like 20 milligrams or something like that. So really the idea is that if you were to stay anywhere below kind of 150, chances are, if you don't have underlying issues, I don't think it's going to be a problem. Now, that's a kind of a random number, because if people don't know how much oxalate is contained within different foods, they don't really know what that means. Dark chocolate, for instance, a whole bar of dark chocolate, if it's in the 99% range, I mean, that can be multiple hundreds of oxalate. I mean, it can even get up to like thousands of oxalate, or 1,000 oxalate if you're eating a lot of that stuff, like in raw cacao powder and stuff. So like you say, are there ways to reduce the amount of oxalate in food? Well, really, there's not. I mean, what you could say is boiling, but because oxalate is soluble in water, or at least the soluble forms are, if you boil a food, for example, say if you've got sweet potato and you either bake it or you boil it, you're going to reduce the amount of oxalate to some extent. Okay, to some extent. It's not going to do massive amounts, but you're going to get some which comes out into the water. Really, that's not like, I mean, it's not a good long-term strategy. Like, you can't just say, like, if you have these health problems and you think you got a problem with oxalate, you can't just say, okay, well, I'm going to keep my diet the same, but all I'm going to do is I'm actually going to boil my vegetables instead of like, baking them. It doesn't really work like that. I'm not sure the exact percentage. Maybe you reduce the oxalate percentage by like 10 or 20%, but that's the maximum. So if you've got a really high oxalate vegetable, then boiling it is not really going to do anything for that.
Even if you're having calcium with it. I was going to say, even if you're having calcium with
So that is one potential strategy, is to take calcium with the food. Boiling, it might reduce it by some percentage, but it's not going to completely inactivate it. Cooking of any kind, that stuff, it does not inactivate oxalate. People who say that, cooking methods and things inactivates oxalate, it's not like a living molecule. It's not an enzyme. It's a physical structure. So you can't inactivate oxalate without using like UVC light. And that's not realistic. That's toxic for human beings. So you can't do much on the cooking front other than avoiding oxalate, boiling it to some extent. With regard to eating it, there's some protective factors. One of those is going to be, calcium, magnesium to some extent, because magnesium does bind with oxalate. And, that's really probably one of your best bets, a mixture of magnesium and calcium to prevent you from absorbing it in the gut. Really, though, I mean, for most people, like if you're in your position and you don't have like a long-term issue with it, then I'd say, yeah, okay, if you're going to go out for dinner, or, you're invited to some event and there's a really high oxalate dish and you decide, okay, I'm going to have some, maybe taking half a teaspoon of calcium before eating it or after eating it would very likely help you prevent you from absorbing a lot of that oxalate. So that's a really good strategy in someone in your position. However, what we have to factor in is that probably a lot of the listeners listening to this who figured, wow, I have those symptoms, goes and have a look at the videos, read some articles and things, and actually decides that they have a problem with oxalate. Well, just taking calcium with a meal is really like it's tip of the iceberg. That's one of the first things, and really that's one of the strategies that you can use at different times. But ultimately, the main aim in this kind of situation is not to start to reduce what's going in from the diet, but really it's about supporting the body's ability to get rid of what it's stored, because it's what's stored that's a problem. It's already too late to focus, to try to focus solely on what's coming in from the diet. It's too late, because they've got a lot of oxalate deposited all throughout the body. It's causing damage, it's causing oxidative stress, and they need to find a way to safely get rid of that. That's not something that we've spoken about. And was there anything else that you wanted to ask about first before I talk about the concept of dumping?
I was going to ask about dumping too, but I have a couple, I think 2 more questions before the dumping question. So it sounds like, if there's really no way for people to know if they have a problem unless they're seeing symptoms. It's not like we are born into this world and we're like, all right, here, you get the sticker. You're the one who's going to have a harder time with oxalates. But I've heard, and this might just be a myth or just like misinformation, but that people who have a high metabolism or people who have an active lifestyle, they're working out a lot, that they wouldn't have as much of a problem with oxalates as somebody else because, I have a better metabolism and I have an active lifestyle. Does any of that play a role into that, or not really?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. Although I'm not entirely sure, but I would be amazed if it didn't. Like, looking at someone who's metabolically healthy, who's fit, like, just from that standpoint, generally they have got better gut function. They have got better digestion. So the digestive predisposing factors, let's say, are not there, that they would be hyperabsorbing oxalate. Is it possible that actually if cells have sufficient ATP, they have sufficient glutathione reserves, that they have a better chance of actually identifying oxalate and carrying it out of the body to prevent it from accumulating? I believe that to be the case, right? I believe that. And I think that that's one of the primary factors which kind of differentiates these people who are very fit and healthy and they do everything else right, yet they eat a bunch of oxalates. I am not saying for any second that they have an oxalate problem, because I don't know if they do. And I think it's probably likely that they don't. Could they develop one long-term consuming massive amounts of oxalate? Yeah, I think it's possible, but also, are they as likely to get it as someone who's not robust physically, who has underlying health conditions? I think there is an element of energy metabolism or bioenergetics which controls, this kind of thing. I think that, and this, as per my knowledge, this hasn't been established in the science. This is kind of a novel concept, but it does make intuitive sense to me, at least, is that if a cell is healthy, if the tissue is healthy, it's going to have way more inherent protection against like a toxin like oxalate and against the production or the kind of accumulation of crystals. But to say that someone is protected and kind of that's justification for having an extremely high amount of oxalate in the diet, I think that's relatively unfounded as well. I don't think anyone has any evidence for that, and I would be concerned about doing that simply because a lot of the foods which are very high in oxalate, they don't contain any special kind of nutrient which is not found in any other food. These are just like standard plants, and most of the time you can get the nutrients everywhere else in other foods which are not high oxalate. So really there's no reason other than addiction and taste for people eating massive amounts of these foods. What we have to factor in is that a lot of high oxalate foods are seasonal in nature. They're seasonal, meaning that we would never have access to these historically all throughout the year. And the problem is with modern, commerce and modern transportation, logistics, we have access to these kinds of, vegetables, fruits, seeds, nuts, spices, all year round. And I think that that's one of the issues as well. And this prevents our body from being able to get rid of it. So we kind of accumulate it long term. So I'd say I kind of probably sit somewhere in the middle. I think that the health of a tissue or the health of a cell does probably affect the ability to protect against oxalate. But at the same time, I don't think that that's a free pass to say, okay, I'll work on being healthy. Yeah, I'll eat, 1,000 milligrams of oxalate every day. I think that that is a recipe for disaster.
You must have then at least heard of the Okinawa And I'm pretty sure, I mean, I know that in, like, for instance, I think Dr. Gundry's book, Plant Paradox, he talks about the Okinawa and that they eat starch or potatoes or white sweet potatoes almost every day.
Yeah, so I mean, but even sweet potatoes every day, I mean, you'd have to be eating like a massive amount to hit 700 milligrams of, sweet potato. If that's the primary form of oxalate that you're getting in the diet, I mean, like you have what? It depends how much sweet potato you'd have to eat. I mean, you'd have to eat 1 kilogram of orange sweet potato to hit 330 milligrams of oxalate, like eating a kilogram of sweet potato is going to be pretty difficult. I mean, like, no doubt they eat lots of other foods as well. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that for some people that wouldn't cause an issue, but it's by no means, upwards of 1,000 milligrams, which is what we see. Oftentimes, sweet potato is just one of many different foods. So let's say if someone's eating sweet potato and that's the only form of oxalate, I'll give you an example. I eat a lot of white potato. Okay. I eat primarily animal-based, but I eat lots of, I say lots, I eat quite a bit of white potato and I eat quite a bit of rice. Like that's basically it. When I eat a bit of fruit here and there. I personally do better with some kind of carbohydrates. Probably 99% of the oxalate that I'm ever going to get in my diet comes from white potato. And the amount that I eat per day still takes it to the amount that is similar to a low oxalate diet. It's sitting in between 50 to 100 milligrams. So what I would say is that if, someone's only got one kind of source of oxalate in their diet, chances are that's not going to be causing massive amounts of these issues. It's probably not even going to be that much of a problem, depending on their context. If, on the other hand, we have, I'll give you an example, right? So we've got someone who has a breakfast, they have almond flour toast, almond butter on that. They might have, what would they have with that? I don't know, maybe some avocado. That's pretty safe. They'd have blueberries. They'd have a whole bowl of berries with that. And then they might have like some kind of like a shake. They might have a shake with like some spices or something like that as well. They might have already hit 600 milligrams just with breakfast, right? And then for lunch, then they have sweet potato. But with the sweet potato, they might have that drizzled with tahini or something, crazy exotic like that. And then, they might have a bit of meat or something here and there, but then they might have a big spinach salad on the side as well. So you see how like it's the cumulative effect. And along with that, they might be putting on copious amounts of black pepper. They might be, using all of these kinds of cumin and other kinds of really high oxalate spices, and it's like a cumulative effect. It's like a conglomeration of all of those things adding up to a massive amount. Whereas if it's just coming from like one or two things, chances are it's going to be difficult to eat enough of that one food to get massive amounts of oxalate in the diet. What I would say about Stephen Gundry, and whilst I am a fan of his work, I think he's done excellent work with lectins. He's got a major blind spot when it comes to oxalate. And I tell you, I've worked with countless people who came to me after going on his protocol, getting better with their autoimmune issue, but then actually developing kidney stones or then developing some kind of terrible, oxalate kind of issue. So they might have helped their autoimmunity, or in some cases, it didn't even help the autoimmunity because it was caused by oxalate in the first place. And it made them worse when they went on his protocol because it is so high in oxalates. He doesn't even acknowledge it. So he's like, okay, you can eat copious amounts of these really high oxalate foods. Yeah, at the same time, this is somehow going to fix your autoimmunity. Again, it's context dependent. So if someone's autoimmunity is triggered by lectins, if it's caused by lectins, by all means, the Gundry protocol is going to work. But if it's caused by oxalate or if it's caused by both, in some people, those kind of protocols actually make things worse. So again, I don't want to poo-poo like anyone, and I'm a massive fan. I've got tons of respect for Stephen Gundry. I would say that, not enough people take into consideration oxalate and really understand how insidious, how long-term, and how chronic its effects are on the body. In fact, one more thing I'd like to say is that it's considered a sensitivity. Now, that's not true. Like, that word is misleading and it's inaccurate. There's no such thing as a sensitivity to oxalate. It's not like phenols, salicylates. These other plant chemicals, they essentially need to be metabolized. To give you an example, phenols go through a pathway called phenol S transferase, right? So enzymes in the liver, which are responsible for basically inactivating these. Now you can support those, you can slow them down, you can increase their activity through using inducers. Now, oftentimes the people who have sensitivities to these is because they can't break them down because their enzymes are slow. When they fix that pathway or whatever, they no longer have a sensitivity. Now, that is not the case with oxalate. Oxalate is a physical toxin. You can't have a sensitivity to it. No, it's either it causes you problems or it doesn't, you know? So I would say that some people, they refer to it as a sensitivity as though you can fix your sensitivity. That is an inaccurate statement, and it's actually, you know, it's harmful for people to think that they can, you know, that they can fix their sensitivity by taking some supplements or whatever. Does not work like that. If they have a problem with oxalate accumulation, chances are they're going to have to be on low oxalate diet for at least a year, maybe even 2 to 5 years. That's how serious it is.
Wow. So if somebody starts having less oxalates, and I know that even within carnivore, you'll hear people say the term oxalate dumping. It's kind of thrown out a lot, but what exactly is oxalate dumping? Why does it happen? And then what are some of the signs and symptoms?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So again, it's in the groups and the community. I think it's thrown about probably more often than it should be. I don't think it applies to everyone. There's natural adaptations when someone goes on to carnivore, but for the purpose of your listener, basically the concept is that as someone goes on a carnivore diet, the amount of oxalate that they eat drops. Someone might feel great for 3 weeks. They might feel great for a week. They might feel great for a couple of days. It can be a couple of months sometimes. Someone goes on a carnivore diet and actually they find that their joint pain of 20 years all of a sudden has disappeared. They might find that their chronic gut issues of 20 years has disappeared. They might find that their headaches or their, you know, sore, achy muscles or whatever kind of health problem it is, their neuropathy, that is no longer a problem for them, right? However, after a short period of time, this sensing mechanism kicks in. It detects that you've got low levels of oxalate in the blood, and your body or your immune system tags the oxalate and actually starts pulling it out of the tissue. And what that does is it triggers the inflammatory response. So this can cause a non-specific innate inflammatory response, which looks similar to if you were to get the flu. So this can be your glands all of a sudden become swollen. You might get elevated body temperature. You might get physical fever. You might get aches and pains. You might feel very fatigued. You might feel as though you're coming down with a cold. And that is generally because you're liberating this toxin, it's stimulating your immune system, and your immune system becomes active. You might also notice that there are gut symptoms or urinary bladder symptoms as well. So oftentimes what people might say is that they're up on the toilet, you know, that they're having to urinate kind of 5 or 6 times a night. They get burning or cloudy urination. The most common symptoms is people actually can see cloudy urine. In some people, what they do is they take samples of it and they let it sit, and there's actually crystals in the pot. So just to kind of demonstrate or suggest to them that they are peeing out oxalate. And oftentimes that will accompany like kidney pain. They might feel as though they've got problems in their kidneys. They might feel as though they've got problems in their bladder. Alternatively, if they're primarily dumping through the gut, they might get very severe watery diarrhea. They might get gut pain. They might get pale stools. They might get sandy stools. It might be like severe watery diarrhea. And in some people, they describe it as like burning as it's coming out. It like burns their tissue, and it might cause like local irritation or tearing and things like that. So it can be very kind of brutal when this stuff is coming out of the body. I haven't come across any fatalities, but I have come across several people who've had to go to the emergency room because they felt as though they were actually going to drop down dead. You know, people who've been made acutely hypokalemic. So what that means is severe potassium deficiency, where they've had such severe heart palpitations, or they've gone dizzy, or they've gone thirsty, and they feel as though they're having a heart attack. They go into the ER. Oftentimes they're told that they have low potassium. They're just given a potassium supplement or something. But generally, what that relates to is that they've stopped oxalate very quickly, and their body was not prepared to dump as much as they could, and they were not replacing electrolytes or anything like that. So they made themselves like acutely electrolyte deficient. So that basically the way to effectively do this is to reduce oxalate very slowly. And the reason to do that is because if you reduce it slowly, then the amount that you dump into your system is much lower. So you slow down the dumping process, you reduce the symptoms that you get, and you actually minimize the damage that is caused by dumping. If they reduce oxalate too quickly, one of the best ways to slow down the dumping symptoms, if they get too extensive or too severe, is by eating an oxalate containing food. Now, you would be amazed at the amount of people who've come to me on carnivore diet who have said that they have got chronic diarrhea and they don't know how to fix it. And they've tried everything. They looked at my video, they tried the vitamin C, they tried the berberine, the milk thistle, that kind of stuff, and it didn't work. Now, I tell you, there's numerous occasions of times when I've said to someone, I've said, right, okay, what I want you to do is I want you to go into your cupboard and I want you to eat some chocolate, some almonds, and some green tea, for instance. Okay. And they'll say, oh no, but what about the oxalates and blah, 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 and blah, 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 blah. And the next day, or even that day, they'll message me and they'll say, oh my God, I can't believe it. The diarrhea that I've had every single day on carnivore for a year has disappeared. I had my first formed stool after eating chocolate and almonds. I don't understand, why does this work? And that's because in those cases, and it's really pretty darn common actually, in those cases, the chronic diarrhea is a consequence or is a sign of chronic oxalate dumping. And that when you take oxalate exogenously in the diet, you prop up those levels, you prevent the body from releasing what it's got stored. Okay. So this can be used as a temporary measure to slow things down. If your symptoms are very severe, you've got very severe bladder pain. I mean, it sounds counterintuitive, eating the food which is actually making you sick, but ultimately, too fast is not better. In fact, going faster is definitely not better. In most cases, going faster is actually worse. And this is why people get themselves into messes. They have severe chronic diarrhea. They have, terrible sleep. They have kind of major electrolyte deficiencies. They go way too quick. So really on the Try and Low Oxalates group on Facebook, they've got a whole guide. They've got, resources and all that kind of stuff. I point everyone in that direction. What they basically do is they have guidelines and they say, look, you want to roughly calculate how much you have and you want to reduce that by about 10% every single week. Now, for people who have a very major issue, they might need to do it slower, reduce it by like 5% every week. So it can take them 10, 15, 20 weeks to even get to the point of a low oxalate diet. And so yeah, it's really like a long-term process for people. It can take several years for people to get to the point where they actually no longer go through these dumping phases. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it made a lot of sense. So it does depend on the person how long someone's going to be going through this oxalate dumping phase. For some people it might be a month, for some people it might be a year, depending on the frequency and the consumption of oxalates throughout their lifetime. I guess just my last question, you kind of talked about it a little bit, but I always am just curious to know, what do you eat in a day to optimize your health? Do you have just kind of like in general, these are my staple foods I eat every day, or each week I kind of have like this variety of foods?
Good question. I eat predominantly red meat, or I eat a lot of red meat. I eat some fish. If I have access to good seafood, I don't live near the coast, I might have some seafood on occasion, a couple times a month. I eat some fruit, so I like the tropical fruit. So I eat a bit of pineapple. I eat some mango, and maybe a couple handfuls of berries here and there. And my main forms of starch is going to be mostly white potato or a little bit of white rice. Probably 80% of my calories are coming from animal foods and animal fats at any one given time. I try to eat organ meats when I can. If not, then I will just take the powder. So I'll just take a tablespoon of liver powder or something if I'm not eating like liver on a regular basis. I actually have hemochromatosis, so I have to watch my my transferrin saturation, my iron levels. However, I don't think that's much of a problem. It's just I'm a little bit cautious about overeating on organ meat, so I kind of keep it to a relatively stable level. I get some kind of odd symptoms if I don't eat liver on a regular basis, so I know that like I need to eat it. I just kind of I avoid it sometimes because I'm not a massive fan of the taste.
It doesn't sound like you have many vegetables then.
No, I don't really have many vegetables. I mean, again, it would be rice or potato. I have some fruit. In terms of vegetables, I have a bit of salad maybe here and there, but that's probably about it. I don't really like vegetables that much, you know.
Awesome.
Oh,
Well,
in fact, I do like olives. I do like olives. I quite like olives and I like chilies. That's a lie. So I eat quite a lot of chili and I like olives every now and again.